Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As my slide immediately acts up, let's try again. Here we go. Welcome to Tech Talks 2020. Our hosts today are Aran, who is unfortunately out ill today, and myself. And then our guests are Joseph Krull of Aite Group and Jay Thorne, a security architect here at API Academy, as well as a product advisor at Layer 7. And what we're going to do today is a panel discussion on OWASP Top 10 and the API Security Top 10. But if you can't hear us at this point, yes, we are talking. If you want to connect to telephone audio, go to the application and locate the audio and select telephone. Dial in using the information provided, not what you see on the screen. Once connected, enter your audio PIN to identify your line, and at that point, you are connected to audio. If you drop for any reason, simply go through the same process to reconnect. Use your control panel to shrink or expand. Handy if you're listening today on a phone or tablet. You can view and select your audio as we just discussed. Very importantly, you can submit a question or comment using the questions tab. And note that today's webinar is muted for recording purposes and will be available at the end of the day on API Academy. So before we get started, as I mention every month, we do have a customized API education course available today. It is the first independent education and certification program for API strategy and design with personalized courses for API designer available today. API security architect, I'm excited to say that it will be available in 2 weeks. And later in the summer, API product manager. These are basically best practices on demand. If you do complete the course, you can take an exam. If you complete the exam, you do get a certification and a badge, which we encourage you to share on LinkedIn to show off your certification status. Complete all 3 courses and you'll receive an API Academy certified badge, as you can see on the bottom right. If you haven't been to the API Academy website lately, we do now include a robust how-to glossary. We do answer frequently asked questions via blogs and videos. And most importantly, we demonstrate best practices for common tasks. We have a regular content cadence, including contributions by industry thought leaders, such as Jay, who's got a Too Long Didn't Read blog series going. And we do offer virtual and worldwide in-person training. If you're attending API Days, you will learn API management and strategy and get in-person support through API Academy workshops. We do have an education tour, which I'll talk about in just 1 second. It's delivered both virtually and in person. And for more information, visit API Academy events to learn about when we'll be near you. Now, that said, here is the list of API Academy workshops that we had all lined up this year. A little bit in the US, a lot in Europe, some in EMEA or in APAC, and finishing up the year in Paris. Those that are asterisked were API Days. We were a global sponsor for API Days this year, and we're really excited about that. Unfortunately, as you know, the world is not quite the same as it was in January. So what we are doing instead, recognizing that the world tour is on hold until 2021 at least, we are going to do on July 15th a North American virtual API Academy workshop. It starts at 9 a.m. You can register at the API Academy. And here's our basic agenda. We're going to do a brief intro to the Academy, the website, the certification program. We're going to have a keynote by a representative from HCL, somebody who's out there actually doing this in the streets every day. He's going to be talking about API strategy with organizational alignment. Then we're going to shift over to actually Jay, coupled with, Aran, coupled with Jamie Ryan. We'll be having a discussion on API design, REST and CRUD versus GraphQL. Then Jay will be talking about service mesh and microservices, and finishing up with one of the foremost knowledgeable persons that I know for API testing and monitoring, Brian Whitmarsh, will be talking about the same. So we look forward to seeing you there. We will also be doing one in EMEA in September, as well as APAC. Our next Tech Talk session is July 29th. We'll be talking about open banking and mock services. But let's get to today's panel discussion and Q&A. And with that, I'm going to ask Joe and Jay in that order to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks very much, Bill. So I'm an information security guy, and I have been in the business for almost 45 years. My first career was with one of those three-letter agencies of the federal government, where I worked all around the world on security issues, mostly in American embassies. But then I moved over to the commercial side of the house, and in the resulting years, I have worked for big consulting companies. I had my own consulting company for a while. I was the chief information security officer for 4 Global 1000 companies. And last year, I retired from Accenture in their Accenture Security Group. I joined Aite Group last year, and I'm an analyst, and I focus on cybersecurity and privacy and IT risk, specifically for the financial services community.
Excellent. Jay?
Hi, folks. I'm Jay Thorne. I've been with the group that produces the API management toolchain for Broadcom for 17 years now. I was the 7th employee of the little startup that got bought. Been a major part of this organization for the entire time. I was the development manager, built the original gateway product, saw it through the acquisition by CA, and then through the acquisition by Broadcom. In that time, I've spent an awful lot of time with customers. We've had a very, very strong customer-driven approach over those years. Spent a lot of time with three-letter agencies, amongst other things, creating features within the product to work in specifically those environments. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time in this API management space.
Cool. So with that in mind, let's get started. Since you both clearly have a lot of background in APIs and security, let's start with Joe. What areas of cybersecurity and application security are you currently engaged in, and are you seeing any emerging or recurring trends?
Absolutely. So that's a pretty topical question. We just released some reports that we did on cyber insurance, because that's an area that our clients are keenly interested in. And there's been a lot of changes in the cyber insurance space, particularly because of the plague of ransomware. We also just did a report last week on how organizations can maximize their cybersecurity budgets. Because you can imagine, with COVID-19, a lot of organizations are seriously looking at how much money they're going to be spending for the remainder of 2020 and into 2021. And there's going to be some difficult decisions made. So right now, it's pretty topical. I'm working on an API security project where I'm interviewing fintechs and insurtechs and end users to try to develop a series of best practices in API security. So this is part of our top 10 trends for 2020, which obviously included ransomware. And we also talked about the risk of cloud misconfigurations, the growing complexity of data privacy compliance, and of course, API security. So I expect that report to be released probably towards the end of July or early August. And we hope to make the world a better place by saying these are the things that we think are the best practices.
Excellent. Anything to add on, Jay?
There's a couple of things that have been happening with me. One of the major things has been spanning the connection between on-prem and cloud and remote enforcement regimes, as it were. So the big thing that we're seeing now is we're seeing people who want to both host some parts of their overall offering on site, and then host parts of it obviously in the cloud. The spanning that gap is one of the biggest things that we've been asked about of late. The question is, how do you make these things happen so that you get consistency and yet not a straitjacket?
Gotcha. So this session is on OWASP and the OWASP top 10, as well as the API security top 10. So Joe, can you tell us a little bit about the OWASP Foundation and a high level overview of the top 10 and the new API security top 10?
Yeah, sure. So believe it or not, OWASP, the project actually goes all the way back to 2001. It seems like a lifetime ago. But the foundation was actually created in 2004, and it's a 501c3 nonprofit, and it supports the projects. So the main thing about OWASP is it has volunteer contributors all over the globe. I mean, you can go to almost any country and you'll find somebody that at least is doing something for OWASP. And the nice thing about it, it's got local chapters in most major cities around the globe as well. So that really localizes it, and you can reach out and get help if you need it by going to a local chapter meeting. OWASP is really cool because they have a lot of events, or at least they did in the pre-COVID-19 period, but many of us have attended the global AppSec meetings, the AppSec USA, AppSec Days, and the LastCon conference, which seems to take place in Austin, which is close to my home. Everyone can contribute to OWASP, and there's a list of ongoing efforts that you can jump onto at OWASP.org. And of course, they're most known for the OWASP Top 10, which is really the Bible, if you will, for application security professionals.
Yeah, you'd think it is. I mean, and I certainly do it that way. But and yet, in my conversations with customers, I constantly hear, when I reference the OWASP Top 10, I constantly hear, "What's that?"
Yeah.
Clearly, it's underappreciated by companies, application developers, and even security professionals. Why do you think that is?
Well, mainly it's because OWASP is run by volunteers, like I said. So the foundation really has limited funding, and the events are primarily subsidized by vendors. So OWASP doesn't really do glitzy marketing of the projects or its initiatives. And you know, when that happens, what they're doing gets drowned out by a sea of marketing from thousands of well-funded companies that are competing to try to get mind share. So, but it's all about awareness. You know, a lot of folks have kind of heard about OWASP, but they really haven't taken the time to go look at all the great materials that are available free of charge from OWASP.org. I think it's just a question of keep putting the word out, keep talking about it, and whenever there's an application security breach or a problem or an issue, that's when you need to reintroduce OWASP to say, hey, had you followed number 6, this would not have happened.
Gotcha. So I want to come back to OWASP in just one second, but in your intro, you stated you were doing a series of reports on API security. Can you share any of the highlights with us?
Yeah, sure. So we started our coverage of API security at the end of 2019. And the reason we did this is we were doing some interviews with a cross-section of security executives, and we found that they really couldn't tell us how many APIs were traversing their networks. They couldn't even get close, or they would refer us to architects or ops people. And it was a lot of shrugged shoulders and flat foreheads because they just didn't know. And this was despite the fact that Akamai had come out with a report that said more than 80% of all internet traffic was related to APIs. So we found that to be a big discrepancy, and we launched our research campaign. We pulled some stuff from Nordic API that said that the average API count for the type of organizations we were speaking to was 620. And the CISOs and security architects, they were off by an order of magnitude. So that's what kind of started this. So what we did was, because of that campaign, we put the API security into our top 10 for 2020. And since then, we've done reporting on API security for API visibility solutions to be able to keep track of what's traversing the network. We featured 3 API security gateway vendors. And as I said, this current initiative, I'm interviewing several dozen representatives, both in devs and security, for fintechs, insurtechs, and banks. And I hope to release that report later this summer.
Gotcha. So this is one of my favorite questions because I actually have a whole deck on this. But in your case, can you provide some examples of what happens when organizations don't place sufficient emphasis on API security?
Oh, that's such an easy question, Bill. They get breached. They get breached. Just ask Google or Strava or Panera Bread or Facebook or Venmo or Marriott or the US Postal Service or Uber or T-Mobile or even the darn government of India. every one of those companies and organizations has had a breach that was either partially or wholly attributed to an API security issue. And in this case, it was, for most of them, it was credential stuffing attacks, where they use a compromised list of usernames and passwords from other sites, and they bombard an app or an API and try to get access, and then pivot that access to higher privileges. We've seen unauthorized database access and data manipulation. We've seen lots of escalation of privileges and denial of service attacks, which you can all do if there are insecurities in the API.
Yeah, and you left out the most important thing, which is you see your company's name on the front page of a lot of reporting websites, and you really don't want your name at that place, at least in that.
That's right. That's right.
How about you, Jay? What have you seen?
Well, I have specifics, and obviously I can't mention them by names, but one of the things that that I'm familiar with is one of the top 10 API attacks, which is the idea of excessive data exposure, and also the idea of authorization at the object level. So in other words, one user able to access every single asset in a system, even though they have no need to know that access, right? So it comes down to that kind of direct exposure of company assets with legitimate credentials, just more than they should have. So that's actually one of the dangers I see in APIs, especially, is great. You've got authorization. Do you have fine-grained authorization? Seen it actually helped ameliorate it myself.
Yeah, so following along those lines, so we're talking about API attacks, and because you're not placing sufficient security on them, how hard really is it to do that? Is it something that can only be done by sophisticated attackers like nation states?
Is that for me, Bill?
Sure, let's start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I initially thought so, but then again, remember, I started in the world of punch cards and 80-column sheets. But when I first started looking at it, I said, well, this must be something that needs to be perpetrated by nation states. But then I went to the RSA conference in San Francisco in February, and my mind changed pretty quickly. There was a 15-year-old high school student there that did a live demo of an attack against a gift card database. And he intercepted and manipulated the APIs to be able to get the values and change those values and essentially do whatever he wanted with that database. And he used some low and no cost tools that really are widely available on the internet. And once I saw the methods that he used, it really changed my point of view. If you know what you're doing and you've got the right tools, this is trivial.
Interesting. So following along those lines, what tactics and tools are attackers using to attack APIs? And let's relate that back to the OWASP top 10 and for APIs.
So we did an analysis of this in one of our reports, and we found some of the tools that they're using. One is called Fiddler, and it's used for communications analysis of HTTP requests. The old toolkit Wireshark, which many of us use for packet analysis. Something called Sentry MBA. It's an automated attack tool for credential stuffing. Another one called SQLI Dumper to do SQL injections. Something called Sniper, which I'd never seen before. Then you can use that to do account checking and start your credential abuse. Another tool called Open Bullet, which is a web test tool that in the wrong hands, it can be used to scrape and parse data. And the reality is if a dev team follows the recommendations of the OWASP top 10 and the top 10 for APIs and implements secure coding practices, the usefulness of all these tools is greatly diminished.
Gotcha. So sticking with the OWASP top 10, last month you actually wrote a blog for API Academy about the risk of security misconfiguration in the inclusion into the top 10. Can you share some of the details with us?
Sure. despite all kinds of awareness and just a slew of tools that the cloud providers and third-party vendors are offering, we're seeing misconfigurations almost every day. And it's really a shame, but let's talk specifically about the July 2019 breach of Capital One. That led to the theft of 100 million customer records, or if you want to look at the April 2019 disclosure of 540 million Facebook accounts on a server at Cultura Colectiva in Mexico. It's amazing how cloud misconfigurations are causing breaches of this magnitude. And it's, specifically around things like misconfigured AWS S3 buckets, which are not set properly when they're configured. And folks use tools to go out and troll the internet and look specifically for unprotected S3 buckets. And this makes the sensitive data available to just about anybody that knows where to look for it. This has to stop, and it's really not that hard. So our advice is that everyone who's responsible for provisioning cloud services or setting up applications or creating the cloud instances themselves or writing code that touches the services really has to be properly trained. And we recommend that their activities be double checked by someone else in the organization, just to make sure that they've done the right thing before you expose hundreds of millions of customer records to the public internet. If you're deploying to AWS specifically, a misconfigured S3 bucket should result in a big flashing yellow light in the configuration console. It'll tell you that you've misconfigured it. But for some reason, these breaches are still happening. And I guess you could say that when you see that orange flashing light, it's probably the same as someone running a traffic light in their car. Generally, nothing happens when you run the light, but in some cases, it can lead to fatalities. So the tool is there, and it's just not being used properly.
Gotcha.
Can I?
Here's one that just came in from our listeners. The OWASP top 10 still includes cross-site scripting. Hasn't this been around for a long time, and why is it still a top 10?
I think Jay wanted to add something to the previous question before we.
Oh, okay. My apologies.
I did have. I found it really interesting that those attacks were against data at rest. Can you talk a little bit about data at rest versus data in motion? We all know that tapping into an existing SSL context is still pretty difficult, even though there's tools. But I'm really interested at this data at rest. So you're suggesting that there were backups of data tables sitting on S3 buckets, for instance, or other things like that. A little bit more about that would be really interesting to me. So that was the vulnerability exploited for some of these things?
Well, this is only based on public knowledge, Jay. We don't know much, but let me just take a breather and say that may be changing. There was a court case just recently where the breach report, the company that did the breach report, now normally those things are done under advice of counsel and they never see the light of day, but a judge has ruled that that report now needs to be released. And that's where you would actually find out what happened in a play-by-play. So we really don't know much, but we assume that it was because what should have been in an encrypted database was not encrypted, and the access privileges were set to worldwide read.
So yeah, that was data at rest somewhere in a place it really shouldn't have been, with obvious mistakes that should have been flagged by the S3 console, and yet. Okay.
So Bill, about your question about cross-site scripting and why are we still seeing it in the OWASP top 10?
Yeah, that was the question.
Yep. I think it's been more than a decade that it's been there, if I recall correctly. And why is it still there? Because it's still happening all the time. And it's really unfortunate, but it's low-hanging fruit. If you've got a good AppSec program and you're doing the right steps along the way during the design and security testing and QA, this should just not happen. But developers are under constant pressure to release new features and if you're in a CI/CD environment where code's going out several times a day, it's really easy to make mistakes. But it's still happening, and we know of a number of breaches that are happening specifically by SQL injection. And it also happens in an API world as well. And a lot of organizations are trying to use API gateways or web application firewalls, and it's not always effective in stopping these attacks in the API space.
Yeah, it just seems like it'd be a really wise move for a dev team to just print out the top 10 and use it as a checklist as they are developing new apps. But I know that's kind of easy to say, harder to do.
The SQL injection one especially seems particularly bad because it's never been considered best practice to take input directly from any kind of web input, and yet apparently this is still done. Do you think the education programs around using these SDKs and APIs is just lacking, or is it the time pressures?
I guess that's directed at me, but yeah, I would say it's a combination of a lot of things. One, I mentioned, the pace of work and the fact that developers are under, these huge time constraints, and it's all about features and functionality. But more importantly, I think that if automated tools are part of your SDLC, and if you're a DevOps shop and you want to aspire to be, DevSecOps, you've got tools that you can implement that at least do high-level checking before the code commits. But here's the issue. In some cases, those tools are not even deployed properly. Or what will happen is code will go through the various process and all the way through until it's time for a penetration test. And it's at the penetration testing level that you find some of those things. Unfortunately, in my interviews with a lot of companies, even penetration testing is not being done on a consistent basis.
Interesting.
So let me ask one for both of you. We've talked about OWASP top 10 being somewhat a hidden jewel, although if you go to OWASP.org, it's right there. But is there something in there that you think is, or what is the most misunderstood or overlooked item in the OWASP top 10 other than the OWASP top 10?
I think if you have basic level understanding of application development and any kind of AppSec awareness, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Because if you go into the supporting docs of OWASP top 10, it gives you very specific threat conditions, very specific things that you should be doing, and it'll even give you examples of how to implement those. I think the problem with OWASP and why it's misunderstood is actually more fundamental than that. And I think we've got a lot of great people in this world that have a lot of knowledge. They've been doing application development most of their adult lives, or they've done some very innovative things, but they don't get involved in OWASP. They're reluctant to kind of play in this sandbox because they think they're intimidated, thinking that they're going to be embarrassed by super technical experts. But the reality is there's lots of volunteer roles you can do with OWASP that can be filled by folks with specific technical or even non-technical expertise. And I'll give you some examples. You can support project workflows. You can work with the communications team. You can help arrange events, or you can just promote what OWASP is doing. So I think we've got a lot of people, maybe some on the webcast today, that could contribute in a big way to OWASP, but for one reason or another, they don't.
Anything to add there, Jay?
A couple things. When I look through the OWASP API Security Top 10, I think one of the things that I would find probably misunderstood is the importance of being very, very selective on what you expose in terms of metadata. For instance, one of the ways that you craft an attack is to find out what fields are available to have a query made against, for instance, and that's your absolutely first spot to do your SQL injection at any input fields. But the things like mass assignment, if that's even allowed, it just seems crazy to me to ever use a mass assignment system on a public API. Now, maybe for an internal one, no problem, but on a public API, and I think one of the things that I would say is the biggest thing here is the difference between something built for your team versus something built for the public. And I really think you have to have a different set of standards. The minute something is exposed, right, you need to have a very different rule set. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting here is the API security top 10 is about public APIs. It's not really about private, only the team over in the other building's ever going to use this. I think that particular distinction is poorly made in most people's minds, because just because the other team is using it doesn't mean the public can. Like function level authorization on an exposed API, the level of scrutiny around that rule set should be the highest ever on a public API. This is where something like using a set of credentials to successfully mine, people's identities and passwords via the API. There's several attacks that are known to have worked that way in the past. Some gaming companies in the past, and I won't even mention names, but this has been a thing where a slow bleed of credentials over an extended period of time via legitimate credentials, but via the broken function level authorization. I think it's really important to note the difference between internal APIs and external. We get involved in both of those things. The security standards for those should be very different.
Valid point. So relating to many of the things we talked about up to this point, developers are usually about creating a really cool experience or making something really cool happen, right? Obviously, security professionals are about protecting assets, protecting reputations, etc. Those can be and are often diametrically opposed. So, Joe, let's start with you. From your experience, what can be done to allow those two personalities to mesh a little bit better than they have in the past?
Oh my, Bill, that could be the subject of a whole panel discussion just in itself, but it's really a complex dance. But here's my advice. About 5-6 years ago, I was full-time working as a bridge between security and devs, and it's really a difficult thing. And all I could say is, if you can take some of the contentiousness out of the relationship, that's a good place to start. But I tell you, a lot of security people don't understand the relationship between them and the developers. And the first time that they drop a 100-page vulnerability report on the developer's desk and walk away, that relationship is soured, and it's very difficult to recover from that. So it's not doing anybody any good when you do that. Even if you found all these great vulnerabilities, the chances of getting those things fixed in that type of relationship is nearly nil. So instead, I think that security people and dev people should both invest in better relationships, and the security folks should provide proper context for what it is they're doing and why security is important, and help them understand, okay, maybe not everything in this 100-page report needs to be done right away, but let's agree that the things that are marked critical or high, at least you should take a look at them and see if those are some things that we can knock out. And if you need some resources or some funding, security is here to help you make that case. And from the development side, I think that they should consider that security people, they have a job to do, and it's an important job. And in some cases, the security people may be just as busy as the devs are. They may have 1,000 things they're working on. So I think it's all about relationship building, and then from there you start off on the right foot.
In other words, they should sit down and have a beer.
That helps, yeah.
There you go. How about you, Jay? Any comments?
Where Joe's going with forging a relationship, I think is absolutely crucial. But I think there's another thing that might be a useful thing to do, and that's agree on methodologies and tooling kind of earlier in the design phase than later in the deployment phase. I know from my personal experience that once you get to close to deploy, there's an awful lot of pressure on a developer to just ship. And the security people are oftentimes, well, they can be overruled and have been overruled in some very specific cases, where even though this API should not be made public, it is, because there is a pressure to ship. And this comes back to a much earlier point around that rush to ship. But I think that security starts in the design phase, and I think tooling matters. So what we talked earlier about CI/CD, and I think that a proper CI/CD tool chain includes, as early as possible, things like SQL injection protection, things like fuzzing attacks, things like validating object access patterns, those kind of things. I think that has to be early. And I believe very strongly that unit tests against those kinds of things become pretty specific to the API, but are pretty necessary. You really need to have that as early as possible in the whole thing. You can't just tack on a penetration test at the end of an 18-month development schedule and just, cross your fingers and hope that everything works. I believe that if you do a test first mentality, now test first gets a lot of argument. I'm not going to argue there, but the sooner you get your security level testing, the more the developers will appreciate that it is necessary to have those to get to production. And I'm going to confess that getting to production is the real thing that I want to do as a developer. I want to ship, right? It's a strong pull. If I want to ship, and the way that security interacts with me is as a gatekeeper, then you've got this adversarial thing happening. But instead, if all along security's there working with you, okay, so we're in early alpha and we just changed our behavior. We now have an injection attack that's succeeding where it didn't used to. Excuse me. That's the kind of thing that can more easily be detected in an earlier phase. It's been said many times that the cost of design flaws, right, are astronomically higher in overall cost the later they are detected. So you have to be able to detect these things as early as possible. I believe very strongly in getting automating testing as soon as you got your builds working. As soon as you've got a successful first build, the next thing you should get is your test regime.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Hey, Bill, let me tack on something there.
Yeah.
In my research, I am still quite surprised how many organizations are not doing threat modeling as part of the design phase. And in the blog post that I wrote yesterday for the API Academy, I think references to two threat modeling frameworks. One is called DREAD, D-R-E-A-D, and the other one's called STRIDE, S-T-R-I-D-E. And you can Google those, and it'll take you out to these methodologies for how to do threat modeling. And that should be the first step. I mean, I don't understand why that step gets skipped, because you can catch a lot of stuff at the very beginning when you're mapping out what you want that application or API to perform.
And that's one of the best practices that API Academy tends to really push is, as Jay just said, security should be through all phases of the project, not tacked on at the end. Going back to API design. So here's another question that just came in from the field, from one of our listeners. We've talked about the OWASP top 10. That's been around, as you said, for quite a while. And now there's this new API security top 10. Can you describe what the differences are?
Well, the top 10 that has been around for a long time is specific to application security. I mean, it's the best practices, if you will. And there's a lot of overlap between the top 10 and the top 10 for APIs, necessarily so because it all, tracks back to good application security practices. But there are some things specifically, and here's a tip. If you just read the cover page of the project, you're not getting the full value. You actually need to go to that project page and go over to the right-hand margin and click on the PDF document. And the PDF document is a very, very detailed explanation of common threats and attacks and risks to APIs. And again, a very prescriptive thing of what you can do to defeat those. So there are some analogies between the two top 10s, but the one for APIs is extremely specific to that world.
Gotcha. So OAuth is obviously huge in, especially in the mobile space. What does that do for me for the top 10?
Jay, you want to take that one?
Well, there's a couple of things. OAuth can be misconstrued as blanket authentication, and so that gives you the vulnerability. It just uses a blanket. The broken user authentication and broken object level authorization become very easy to fail at. Just because you've got an OAuth token doesn't mean you have access to this object. So while OAuth handles authentication and some level of authorization, it's quite coarse-grained. So one of the things that really has to happen is beyond just the OAuth story of getting a credential, that is provided by a trusted provider. The next step is to then get the level of user level authorization so that the user named in that credential. And then there's of course the idea that it's possible to mine OAuth tokens from other users. So the controlling the overall provenance of OAuth tokens and things like that with cryptographic methods and things of that nature becomes a pretty essential part of making API security work. I can't stress enough how important I think the distinction between content awareness versus context awareness. So for instance, yes, you've got a user, great, it's up in an HTTP header, but in the body of this API call, you've got a reference to a different user ID. Is that even allowed? That becomes a very important point to make, is that I believe context and content awareness, being able to pick apart the API call and look at what's in there and compare it against the credentials provided, is the essence of the deep level security that things like broken object level authorization, mass assignment, function level authorization are all about. It's really the context versus content duality, as always.
Bill, I'll just tack on to that. This is where we see a lot of misunderstanding. OAuth doesn't provide authentication, it's only authorization. And what we see is where developers get in trouble is they don't follow these standards. They try to roll their own, or they try to implement things that are OAuth-like, but don't fully meet the OAuth specification. But if you do implement OAuth for APIs, you're going to satisfy the first and fifth areas of the OWASP API security one, you'll cover them off. If you do it properly, you've covered off those two requirements. So it is important, but don't deviate from the spec.
So you just asked or made an interesting lead into that. If you use OAuth, so what if I don't? How does OAuth differ from approaches like HTTP Basic, and which one should I use?
Well, if you're going to use HTTP Basic, you're going to be dealing with lots of usernames and passwords. Do you really want to manage those? Do you want to send those every time you want to access an application or pull data? If you use OAuth, the applications don't rely on those, and that's going to reduce the risk of compromise. In some cases, the application won't even know based upon the user credentials. It's going to be based on that token itself. So I don't want to be managing lots and lots of credentials that can be compromised and reused, because unfortunately, people will reuse usernames and passwords across multiple applications. That just makes it easy if I'm an attacker.
Right. Valid point. So this is a little bit more of a complex one. So I'm going to ask Joe for you to tackle it first. So over the last year, we've heard a lot about GDPR. We've got CCPA, we've got HIPAA, we've got all these government identity protections required around the world, where not only encryption at rest is a huge concern, but also the movement of data across different geographical regions. So how are you seeing companies tackle this expanding scope of data portability and geographic fencing requirements in distributed architectures?
Oh boy. Boy, you really like to open up a can of worms here, but yeah, you're right. And there has been a lot of work in this space, and a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the cloud vendors. And they're investing tons of money in these regional data centers where they can channel data into a zone or even a specific country to meet this huge plethora of privacy requirements. And I'll give you a perfect example. Azure Germany, Microsoft's Azure Germany, claims to meet all of the stringent European and German data privacy requirements. And you can force route to this data center if you're a client to keep the data from going to any of their other 61 regional data centers around the world. So I think that the cloud operators have the most to offer in this space. And application and data architects are probably going to rely on that until something better comes along. But that's how it's being addressed today.
Joe, can I redirect on that? This is not.
Yeah, sure.
It's interesting that you would say that the cloud providers are leading the way. Aren't they also the most vulnerable? Aren't they also the ones with the most to lose here? Aren't they the ones?
They are, Jay, absolutely. But the cloud space is pretty competitive, and they want to have differentiation between those different services. And if privacy is something that an organization is very concerned about, they're going to look for the cloud provider that is the easiest for them to meet those regulatory requirements and the least impact on having to recode applications. So they've got skin in the game and they've got a lot to lose, but you've got evidence that they're making these investments. They're building these data centers all over the world now, and that's not trivial. That costs money.
From my experience, Germany especially is really stringent about its enforcement around GDPR and things like that. Other countries in Europe as well, but Germany is the one that I hear about it the most from. But I find it really interesting, hearkening back to a much earlier part of this conversation where you talked about data at rest being attacked within a cloud provider. I find that just they're the same. They're a flip side of the same thing. If you use, cloud storage data at rest, then suddenly the sensitive data exposure is now one of your biggest concerns. I think that the fact that it's a competitive market is a great thing, but I also think that as soon as you do that, you need to put yourself under more scrutiny. As soon as you decide that you're going to be in multi-geo, then suddenly your data at rest, your data in motion, and your storage and certainly backups and things like that require a very different approach. Passing a PCI or a HIPAA audit is one thing, but the other stuff, the backups, all of that other kind of thing, the multi-zone stuff, I think it requires a different level of scrutiny. And I find it very interesting that the cloud providers are actually doing probably more work around this than ever in the past.
Interesting. Here is kind of a higher level one for you. What is one thing that an organization can do today to improve application security? Just one thing.
One thing, huh? Well, I'll go back to the blog post I did yesterday, Bill. I think it's application security training for developers. I think it's all about awareness. Again, I scratch my head and I wonder why. I'm talking to lots of big organizations and brand names, and when I ask them if they have mandatory security training for application developers, the answer is not always yes, or the content of that training is pretty uninteresting, if I could use a kind of a high level term. I think that every developer should understand what is the risk, what's the worst that can possibly happen if I do X, Y, or Z. And if that training is interesting, if that training is something that they can make relevant to the job that they're trying to accomplish, if it's not just web-based stuff where you're looking at static PowerPoint presentations, if it's multimedia, if it's things where they can do specific use cases on demand, there's a lot of good material out there, and we're just not directing it to the right place. But I think that application developers are genuinely interested in security, but you have to kind of bring them to the point where it's worth their while to go through, training that is interesting and compelling and is relevant to what they're doing. But most of the application security training I've seen has been horrible, absolutely horrible.
Not gonna argue that one. How about you, Jay?
Again, a query back to Joe. Application security training, I think, is awesome. I wonder sometimes if the way that these things should be set up is actually the other way. Teach developers how to compromise their own code, to teach them, to teach them how to prevent from getting in. This is sort of an odd thought, but half of your work, Joe, comes from, analyzing breaches and things that have happened. And it just seems to me that that's the kind of thing that we should be teaching, amongst other things, is the Sony attack happened this way, the attacks against this company happened that way, and all of those kinds of this is what the attack was, and this is how it worked. So rather than, oh, you should sanitize all your input, which is really fatuous to say just that in a training thing, but instead say, yeah, they followed best practices except for this one missed point. They didn't do this, and because of that, this other thing happened. I just think that maybe as you say, the quality of the training is important. I think that's probably the crucial point for me, is that, just a video presentation that you sit dumbly through and click okay, doesn't teach you enough. You really need to know what was used to make an attack occur, especially if it's industry specific. I think that would be completely great. If you're in a bank, you want to hear about the bank compromises. If you're, in an online game, you want to know about the online game compromises.
That's a great idea. Great idea.
I'll go back to something I said at the very beginning. I think the one thing that you can do is go up to OWASP.org, print out the top 10 as well as the API top 10, and have them as check marks next to your console. So we're coming up to the end of the session here. I do have one more question, and it's kind of an interesting one. And I'm going to start with Joe, but Jay, be ready for this. So we have the OWASP top 10. What would number 11 be?
Well, I hate to repeat myself, but if we have this wonderful top 10, which is very prescriptive and it's got a lot of good details in it, it doesn't do any good if nobody knows about it. And it doesn't do any good if people don't use it. So the OWASP top 11, if you will, should be that if you're going to code a sensitive application that deals with things like personally identifiable information, or it goes to pulling data from a sensitive database, or it deals with privacy data, I think that a developer should have some type of acknowledgement where they read and sign that says, I have reviewed the top 10 for OWASP or the top 10 for APIs, and I acknowledge the threats and risks and things that I can do to do better application development. That would be the 11th. It would be holding some type of standard that says, oh yeah, I know about these things, I've been exposed to them, and I'm going to do my best to avoid them in my business.
I would totally agree. How about you, Jay?
I think top 10 item 0, so the 11th one, is awareness, visibility, knowledge. The number of times where we've actually seen people say, oh, we don't need that, is crazy. In 2020, people saying, oh, we don't need to do X, Y, or Z, and something that's clearly on the top 10. So this awareness, yeah, but it's first. You need to have this, that this even exists is is the first requirement.
Yep, I would definitely concur with that also.
Security, right? The Broadcom product line, and the number of times I've been told by prospective customers, we don't need this, is frightening.
Yeah, that's exactly why I have a security deck filled with stories of people who didn't need it and then they did. So, and I'm going to give another plug out to the API Security Architect course that's shipping in 2 weeks, or at least publicly in 2 weeks. If you check back late next week, it may be up there live, but it's going to go public right after the 4th of July weekend here in the US. So with that, I want to thank both Joe and Jay for taking time out of their incredibly busy days to participate with us today. I want to thank our attendees for taking an hour and dropping in, and hopefully you got quite a bit out of it. As I mentioned before, this session will be available online later today. It takes about 4 hours for GoToWebinar to actually compile the recording and make it available to me, and then I'll throw it up on API Academy. So with that, thank you again. I appreciate it, and we will see you next month. And one last quick plug, don't forget about July 15th API Academy Virtual Workshop. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.